When a grain grower thinks about weed management, it's likely he'll picture those weeds he last saw in the paddock and not about the weed seed bank beneath the soil. And it's even less likely he'll think about how those weeds originally came to be in his paddock. In this integrated weed management video, we'll look at farm hygiene as part of weed management. Weeds can be carried onto a farm in many ways, including with contractor machinery. A dedicated area where this equipment can be cleaned before work starts is recommended. This location should be monitored and any weed germination quickly treated. Also, record the position where the machinery starts work, and if a breakdown occurs, use GPS to log that position as well, so that any follow-up spot checks can be made to check for weed germination at these locations. Other vehicles can also bring weed seed onto the place, and owners should, as a matter of responsibility, keep their vehicles as clean as possible. Footwells in particular should be given close attention. The type of weeds that are going to establish in your paddocks are the same species found on roadsides, around yards and sheds, and fence lines. Places where there's little competition and their control is often secondary to the farm's main weed management strategy. These weeds need to be sprayed with residual herbicide and be eliminated so as not to become a breeding stock for future infestation. And neighbours should be encouraged to keep their roads and fence lines treated. What's even more concerning is that fence lines can be the source of herbicide-resistant weeds establishing in paddocks.
If you don't manage weeds on fence lines, the seed can be picked up with a harvester and get out into the crop. It becomes particularly difficult where you end up with glyphosate resistance on fence lines. So this is one of our trials. It's on glyphosate resistant ryegrass, and here's where glyphosate has not controlled the ryegrass. And over here we have an alternative treatment that has controlled the ryegrass. What this trial is about is looking at alternatives, and in particular trying to find some new chemistry that we can use on fence lines. So we're looking at a variety of different chemicals with the idea that some might end up being registered.
Spraying is not the only way fence line weeds can be managed. Non-aggressive, non-spreading trees or shrubs can keep the ground between paddocks or fence lines weed-free. Alternatively, a slashed or cultivated strip between the fence and the crop can reduce weed numbers, or baling the strip around the paddock's perimeter to capture weed seeds also is an alternative to chemical weed control. Another potential source of weed contamination is livestock and their feed. A holding paddock where replacement animals can spend a quarantine period will help contain any weed seed that might pass through the animal. And a similar storage area for hay will lessen the risk of weed seed spread. Monitor the areas for weed germination so early control can be implemented. Also, find out where the purchased feed has come from and the supplier's or region's weed status, so you know what you could be up against. Random patches of weeds within a paddock could be the result of poor spray application or a weather-affected application, even the use of wrong herbicide, or due to those weeds having developed herbicide resistance. These blowouts should be given high priority and not allowed to set seed. It's recommended these areas be either slashed or cultivated, or consider working the entire paddock to avoid seed bank build-up and these weed populations becoming widespread infestations in coming seasons. Previously treated or clean paddocks might only require a weed seeker or sensor-controlled spray gear to take care of the odd trouble spot.
These are the weed seeker units. They've got an infrared light source in the front with a sensor behind that, and then they activate the solenoid back here to spray the weed. We've been using a weed seeker for probably nearly 10 years now, since they first came out, and The main reasons for the weed seeker is that we can go in and economically spray higher rates of chemical because we might only do 5% of the paddock. It's a very good weapon against resistance in that we can use expensive whatever chemicals we want to because we can do it very economically.
On most farms there's a weed seed bank that has to be managed. That starts at sowing, and seed for the next season should be collected from the cleanest paddocks or purchased from a reputable supplier, and ask if the seed is from a non-herbicide resistant area. At the other end of the season, harvest weed seed management needs to be implemented. When harvesting, ideally start with the cleanest paddocks and leave the dirtiest until last. Windrowing and seed collection equipment such as chaff carts and Harrington seed destructors help break the cycle of weed seed being returned to the paddock. At the end of harvest, thoroughly clean the machinery, update paddock histories and make farm hygiene part of your farm's ongoing weed management strategy.